We're pleased to be partnered with the Broadcasting Board of Governors as we launch a monthly series on topical research findings from various markets around the world. This effort is in support of BBG's mission to inform, engage, and connect people around the world in support of freedom and democracy. We begin with a look at new research from Iran. Next month, on July 26th, we'll focus on Tibet. The following month, August 16th, we'll focus on Nigeria, and September 20th on Burma. Some real topical countries of interest and some real powerful and very interesting research findings from these countries. I'd like to start by introducing our first speaker, Mr. Bruce Sherman from the BBG, who will set the stage for today's session and all future sessions. Mr. Sherman is the Director of Strategy and Development at BBG. He joined the BBG in 1996 after 12 years at Radio Marti, the broadcasting service for Cuba. In his role today, he directs formulation and execution of BBG strategy, leading a team of senior managers and planners across all broadcast groups. He has overseen development of the 3 5-year strategic plans, including the most recent 2012-2016, and is their principal author. Sherman also has played a central role in launching new strategic initiatives for the Muslim world, including Radio Sawa and Al Hurra TV for the Middle East and Radio Farda for Iran. These and other strategic initiatives since 2002 have expanded the BBG's worldwide audience from 100 million to over 185 million people weekly. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Bruce Sherman.
Thank you, Chris, and welcome everyone to the first in what will be a series, as Chris has just announced, research briefings based on the new partnership between BBG and Gallup and the worldwide media research that we are now undertaking with Gallup. Let me give you just a little bit of historical perspective in just a couple of minutes and then turn it over to Rajesh and Bill to walk through the data on Iran. Some of you may not be aware that for decades, U.S. International Broadcasting has been doing in-depth market and audience research all over the world. In fact, I see in the crowd today Ross Johnson, who was a director at Radio Liberty for many years, Radio Free Europe, Woody Demitz, who was involved in research at the old USIA and with the BBG. For many, many years, we've been doing research in an attempt to understand the audiences that we're trying to reach in our programming. So critical to our success and our endeavor is precisely in looking at the markets we operate in, the markets we're targeting with our broadcast and our media efforts, and the people in those countries. So this new BBG Gallup partnership is the continuation of that effort. And as Chris just mentioned, we are interested in doing what we can to share information from our studies. Over the many decades we've been doing research, we have been asked many, many times if we could share information with the broader public. And so this series is an attempt to do that. It's an attempt to do that in the following way. We want to be able to provide top-line media access use data through these briefings and in accompanying handouts. By that I mean, how are people, say, in the country of Iran using media? What sources of news do they turn to? That kind of information we're very interested in providing to give you an understanding about what's happening in Iran, to help you, of course, understand the window that we're looking through as we shape our own broadcasts for Iran. We're not principally focused here on the performance data for our broadcasters. That's a separate topic. We're not focused on the performance data of other organizations that are captured in our survey. That's also a separate topic. We really want to nurture a conversation around what's happening in these societies and in the public domain, share that information so that we can make others the beneficiary of what we're seeing. We are taxpayer funded. We have an obligation to the public to be as transparent and as open as we possibly can about the information we're acquiring. So in that spirit, too, this series fits nicely, and it's part of what our new board, as of a year and a half ago, set for the BBG, which is a standard of transparency in our operations. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Rajesh. He'll start walking us through the data. We look forward to a very good conversation, and we're happy to take questions during the Q&A period.
We've got two speakers this morning, my colleague Dr. Rajesh Srinivasan and Mr. William Bell from the Broadcasting Board of Governors from Voice of America, who will present some of these research findings. I'm going to introduce both of them right now so that we can transition from one presentation to the other more seamlessly. Rajesh Srinivasan is a principal with Gallup and program manager on the BBG International Audience Research Program. Dr. Srinivasan directs the World Poll as well across Asia and the Middle East and provides technical leadership on the global effort. World Poll is the largest available source of key world data, providing access to the voices, hearts, and minds of citizens in more than 160 countries and areas. Dr. Srinivasan joined Gallup in 1993. Before joining the World Poll team in 2005, he spent more than 12 years consulting with corporate clients in the United States and Asia in industries such as banking, hospitality, telecommunications, healthcare, and education. Mr. William Bell, Director of Research for the International Broadcasting Bureau, oversees all audience research activities for the Voice of America and the Office of Cuba Broadcasting. Bell founded IBB's Audience Research Department and now leads a team of research professionals managing more than 70 projects a year worldwide. Prior to assuming this position, Mr. Bell served as Deputy Director of Affiliate Relations for VOA and as Deputy Policy Manager for the former U.S. Information Agency's WorldNet satellite TV service. Bell began his career as a Foreign Service officer, serving as Cultural Affairs Officer at the U.S. Embassy in Cameroon and as Deputy Public Affairs Officer in New Zealand. Mr. Bell holds master's degrees in international relations from the Fletcher School of Public Diplomacy and in survey methodology from the University of Maryland. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rajesh Srinivasan and Mr. William Bell.
Thank you, Chris. In case you didn't realize, I do look very different from Chris Stewart. So, I think people were expecting Rajesh Srinivasan when you walked over. So, just want to make sure it's clear. Welcome, everyone, and I'm really excited to see such a large turnout for our first event. The first part of the presentation is going to be really covering the top-line findings, as Bruce pointed out, about media access usage. And then we will get into the subtle nuances of what this data means, and that's where Bill will be joining us. To set the stage, we conducted this study in March. It was a very narrow window of opportunity that we had to complete the survey in right after the elections and before their Persian New Year, Nowruz. We covered all 31 provinces. The survey was done via telephone from outside the country, and it was a sample size of 2,000. For the first time, we included both landline and mobile phones, simply to be able to say we are increasing our coverage, because in the past we've had some issues with respect to landlines alone providing sufficient coverage, so this is the first time we are attempting that. The field period, as it points out, is between March 3rd and March 30th. We were hoping to complete before Nowruz, but we had to bleed into a bit of Nowruz there. One important thing to remember here is that for purposes of continuity, we were using the same provider or data collector as in past waves of data collection. So there's a continuity as far as who has been gathering data for the Iran study. Moving on to the key parts of the data, we'll first start with access, any kind of access to media. It's not surprising, or rather for some people it may be surprising, but TV and mobile phone access is significant in this market. These are just ownership of these products in the households, and they are in working condition. So we're not talking about usage, it's just purely access at this point in time. Mobile phone access or ownership in the household is very high, 90%. However, if you look at personal ownership, it's only about 40%, which means there's a fair amount of sharing that takes place within households. Computer ownership is pretty high. 2/3 of households say they have a computer, working computer. Radio, about 50%. And what is most interesting is internet, which is 43%. And about a fourth of Iranians say they have a working satellite dish in their household, which is pretty interesting because it is considered sort of a banned product. And for somebody to be even able to admit that they have one, it's a remarkable thing. Moving on to one of the things that Gallup has been doing is, as part of the World Poll effort, gathering a whole lot of information on technology ownership and technology access across over 150 countries. And as part of this initiative, we have developed an index which is called as the Communication Index. It's really looking at ownership of computers, internet, and mobile phones in the household, at the household level. So based on that, we put together what is called as a communication index, and in this slide, you can see where Iran stacks up based on the most recent data that we've gathered in 2011. It's somewhere right around where Turkey's number is, about 80.4 is what Turkey's index is on communications, and Iran is 80.2. Clearly, the group of countries around Iran are definitely, in terms of saturation of technology, at least lower than where the GCC countries are. So that's the big sort of takeaway from there. But I think a large part of this number for Iran, at least, is being driven by the mobile phone explosion. As you saw in the previous slide, computer and internet is still, lagging behind, but mobiles seem to be taking on very significantly. Moving on to usage. We talked about access. Now we're moving on to usage. You can see that, again, TV dominates media use in terms of it's pretty much a vast majority of Iranians are using it on a very regular basis, either yesterday or in the past week. Mobile phone usage is also pretty significant, but 8 in 10 say they are using mobile phones regularly, and almost half of them using it on a daily basis. Radio usage, of course, is pretty high, and 30% are using it on a daily basis, a fairly sort of loyal audience, I would say, of radio. Clearly, education has a significant role as far as radio usage is concerned. Its index is significantly higher among those with secondary education, post-secondary education. Almost 2/3 of those with post-secondary education seem to be listening to radios on a regular basis. Satellite TV, about 1 in 3 use it on a regular basis in FM radio, and the remaining radios, more of a niche market. What's most interesting in this is the internet part. About 39% of Iranians say they've used internet in the past week. That's probably the highest number we've seen ever for Iran so far. And not surprisingly, again, it indexes pretty high among the youth, 15 to 24, which is about 53% of the 15 to 24 say they've used internet in the past week. And among the post-secondary education, about 2/3. We've looked at usage for any kind of information, whether it's media, entertainment. What happens to usage of news and information? When we look at news and information, again, TV dominates. 86% of the people Iranians say that they use TV for news and information on a daily basis. That's how they consume news and information, through TV. About 1 in 5 say they use it through a mobile phone. They access news and information through a mobile phone, again, on a daily basis, which is pretty high. And clearly, a large part of this is coming from the younger generation, who seem to be receiving and sharing news via mobile phones. Radio, newspapers, the traditional media is about 1 in 6. Internet, interestingly, is about 13% say they receive news and information through the internet. And if you think about the daily users of internet, we found the daily user of internet was about 20%, and 13% of them are getting news and information on a daily basis through the internet. So, which is a pretty significant proportion of internet users are getting news and information through that. International TV is about 12%. If you want to translate this into some numbers, we're really talking about 7 million Iranians getting news and information on a daily basis through international TV. So it's a really significant audience there. Social networks, of course, index is pretty low at this point. Let's now specifically look at digital media and how Iranians are using digital media. What are they watching? What are they gathering when they go online? What kinds of sites are they visiting? And how exactly are they sharing? Among past week internet users, which is people who say they've used the internet in the past 7 days or on a daily basis, the vast majority are accessing internet in the privacy of their homes, 80%. About a third are accessing it in the internet cafes and schools and mobiles, much lower. Vast majority of the youth seem to be accessing internet at home and in internet cafes and at school. The working mostly in the workplace. The mobile, of course, is very interesting because, again, it seems to be fairly high on the younger population. What are they using the internet for? It's largely to send and receive emails as well as to access news and information. Those are the top three that show up. But we are also seeing some interesting pattern here in terms of almost 29% saying they are listening to audio, they're watching video. So this sort of suggests that the access speeds and stuff must be fairly good enough for them to be downloading audio or listening to audio or downloading video. So there's always a suspicion because there's a fair amount of access is dial-up to what extent they are able to do many of these activities. So it's interesting to see a fair number saying that they're actually accessing audio and video stuff. And postings to social network sites is about 13%. What sites have they visited in the past week? Going back to the previous slides, if vast majority are accessing news and information, it's not surprising they're going through a search engine. So Google and Yahoo index is pretty high in terms of the sites that are most likely to be visited. Facebook also registers there as in terms of social network, that's the biggest one out there with 13%. And then you have a whole number of other broadcasters and stuff at 3 and 2%, much smaller numbers. We asked an interesting question here in terms of people who are past week internet users, to what extent they actually, when they see some interesting news, how likely are they to be able to, do they actually share it with friends and family? And 2/3 of the past week internet users actually do share actively news and information with friends and family. It still seems like even though they're getting the information on the internet, a fair number of them are still sharing it verbally. So it could be that they find this to be sensitive information and they don't want to be seen as sharing it via the internet or some other means. Another 24% are sharing it via SMS with links. This again goes back to the amount of news sharing that's happening through mobile phones that we had seen earlier. So there's a pretty strong link that's happening. Again, largely among the younger population. And then about 4% saying that they actually post on social network sites. So this is sort of the brave audience probably out there. We have seen so far more of the highlights of what's happening with respect to general media access, usage, and specifically in terms of digital media, how people use it and how people share. I think I'm going to turn it over now to Bill to talk about what these numbers mean for broadcasters, and particularly in terms of how to leverage this and how to take advantage of these changes that are taking place in the Iranian media environment. Thank you.
Good morning. Thanks, Rajesh. Just a word of warning to start off. In the interest of keeping the audience awake and alert, we've done a last-minute change in the order of the slides. So those who are following along with the printed text, you'll see a slight alteration. Stick with us, and you'll come back on course in just a few minutes. Rajesh has given us some of the basic top-line data about what we found in this year's survey in Iran. I'm going to try to go behind the numbers a bit, add a little bit of nuance to the picture. And in doing this, I'll be relying not only on this year's survey, but also on some other research that we at BBG have done in previous years, both survey and qualitative in nature. So I'd like to look a little bit at what is driving media consumption patterns, how attitudes affect choice, and so on. We've already seen that television is the leading source of information in Iran. In particular, IRIB, the state network or collection of stations, is by far the most important. This is the results from a question in which we asked our survey respondents to name spontaneously the top 3 information sources, whether they be TV stations, radio stations, newspapers, internet sites, or so on. And you can see these are the percentages naming each of these various outlets among the top 3. And you can see IRIB very much at the top of the list as the most important. Doesn't mean this isn't reach. This is about the relative importance of these different outlets. Well, you might think, okay, many Iranians may not be that politicized. They just rely reflexively on state TV. But looking back at some earlier data, and this was done in 2009, just after the elections, the very much disputed elections, as you recall, in Iran, we found we were able, through some attitudinal questions in that work, to segment the audience into people we identified as pro-reform versus others, and look at how their media attitudes compared. And you can see that the reformers were much more likely to use international TV, international websites, as one might expect. But if you look at the top, there was almost no difference between these two groups in their stated reliance on Iranian TV, state TV, to follow the news about the elections, which were very much the subject of debate and dispute at that time. So even looking at this difference between the two attitudinal groups, they were still relying very heavily on state broadcasting. So pretty much a universal phenomenon, regardless of political affiliation or viewpoints. Now, why might this be? The first thing to bear in mind is that the fact that people use a particular outlet doesn't mean they trust it. And this is something we've observed in many closed societies around the world. You see very high levels of usage of state media, even among people who are opposed to their regime, who don't trust those particular media. The sheer availability, ubiquity of state television in particular, leads to very high usage figures. Secondly, and again, this is true of many closed societies, we find that Iranians are quite sophisticated at knowing what they can use different media for. So there are certain topics that state media might be just fine for covering without bias and fairly, others where it's not. And so there may be a usage of state media for some things, but not for others. Thirdly, I call this know thine enemy. There's, even among those opposed to the regime, there's an interest, a perceived obligation to understand what the authorities are saying, what the government policies are at any given time. So you have to watch state TV to understand what's going on in the country, even if you're opposed to it. Finally, and once again, this is typical of many closed societies, citizens in these countries, and Iran is certainly a case in point, tend to develop a certain sense of cynicism about media in general, and reserve trust, unqualified trust in all media sources to some extent. And so you get a situation where there's a feeling that we need to triangulate to find out what the truth is from lots of different sources, and if we look at enough places, we'll figure out what really is going on. And here are some quotes to illustrate some of these points from some qualitative research that we did last year with Iranian travelers. And you can see up at the top this individual saying, well, we hate state TV, but we have to watch it to find out what the policy of the government is, as I was just saying. Down below, a similar quote to that respect as well. So let's talk a little bit now specifically about what I refer to as external media, and I'm using the term a little bit loosely here to talk about media that are not under the control of the Iranian regime, specifically satellite TV, the internet, although of course internet sites originate in Iran as well as outside, but not directly controlled, at least not at this point, and shortwave radio as well, all from outside of the country. Why are people turning to external media in Iran? Well, obviously, there are many positive aspects of it, most importantly, the fact that it can report on domestic affairs without any censorship. A second point worth bearing in mind, and this is something we maybe pay a little bit less attention to, is the entertainment programming, the cultural programming that can be found on external sources different from what's available locally. There's some negatives as well, however. And we found this in Iran and other similar closed societies as well. No matter how opposed people are to their regime and to that regime's policies, there is often a suspicion, a dislike of what is perceived to be criticism coming from outside. I can criticize my family. If the criticism comes from outside of my family, I react badly to it. And so there is there's always that layer of suspicion with respect to outside sources that's lurking in the background. And it means as programmers, we need to be extremely careful how we talk about internal affairs. Secondly, and this gets back to the cynicism point I mentioned earlier, there is a fairly widespread assumption that there is an agenda behind all media, and one needs to be aware of that and take it into account in turning to different media sources. And we can see some of these attitudes reflected, some of this ambiguity reflected in some of the data from this year's survey. We asked how trustworthy the news and information is on a number of different outlets. You can see IRB at the top and then the various international stations down below. Two things stand out here. While IRB was more trusted, and one can't discount the possible impact of social desirability effects in this data, only half of the respondents, and these are all people who watch or listen to these specific stations, only half of IRB's audience says they're very trustworthy. So there's a fair reserve in people's attitudes towards the state broadcaster there, even though the level of trust, expressed trust at least, is higher than is the case for the international broadcasters, reflecting perhaps again that reserve we spoke about a minute ago. A similar question, we read out a series of statements about the journalistic qualities of various stations and asked which ones fit in those categories. This was a question of which stations are unbiased. And again, you can see IRB at the top with more people saying it's unbiased than any of the international stations, but still fewer than half of those who watched IRB said, yes, this station is unbiased. So again, we can see some preference with respect to this criterion for the domestic station vis-a-vis the others, but low levels of trust on this criterion in all the stations that we're talking about. And you can see some of this ambiguity working through again back on some of the qualitative research, looking specifically at VOA, because this is what our qualitative research has tended to focus on. The fellow up at the top saying VOA is not objective, they just support American government policy. You look at the third quote, this gentleman says they're not objective, but that's perfectly normal and acceptable. We wouldn't expect them to be objective because they're an American station, and that's perfectly all right that they do that. So there's quite a variety of, and quite a bit of nuance in people's attitudes, but you can see this ambiguity coming through and how people assess foreign media. So let's get to a little bit of additional data here, specifically on the use of external sources as I've defined them there and how widespread they are. And they are widespread indeed. You can see in this slide that 33% of our respondents, that's the adult population in effect, say they have used one of the three external sources I cited, that's internet, satellite TV, or shortwave radio, in the previous day. A third of the population stepping outside of the state-controlled media environment, and you can see here the specific figures for each of those media outlets. Things get a little more interesting when you try to break this down by demographics. The dependence on the external sources is a bit higher among males than females. This is quite similar to results we've seen in other countries. Inversely correlated with age, greater dependence on the part of younger populations, and as one would expect, greater dependence on the part of the higher educated and the external sources. We see this a bit less looking specifically at satellite TV. The demographic differences there are not great until you get to education, where there's a high reliance on satellite TV among the higher educated. Of course, education here might be a proxy for social economic status, people more likely to have satellite dishes, so there's some impact there. Internet use is much more variable by demographics, fairly significant male-female gap there, much heavier use among the younger population, and far heavier use among those with higher education, as you might expect. And in fact, if you add these factors together, if you look at those who are male, who are younger, and who have higher education, about half of that population group has used the internet in the previous day, and over 80% in the past week. So very, very important information source for that important population segment. What's also worthy of note is that these external media sources are growing very, very rapidly. This is the past 4 years of data from the surveys that we at BBG have undertaken, and these lines show yesterday and past week use, respectively, of the internet. and you can see the trend is relentlessly upwards. And in fact, since 2010, past week internet use, as well as past day internet use in Iran has doubled. And this is pretty remarkable, particularly in view of the attempts the Iranian authorities have been making quite aggressively to control the use of the internet, and as I think most people in this room know, to wall off the country from outside sources on the internet. I don't think they've been successful in that yet, but it remains to be seen how well they will be. But it's not always easy to use this medium, and yet the growth is phenomenal and continuing as far as we've seen to date. Similarly, with satellite dish ownership, a big change, big growth from 15% in 2009 to 26% today. We suspect there's some underreporting as well, and in fact, we know even from the survey research that a larger percentage than is shown here watch satellite TV. 33% in our last survey said they had watched satellite TV in the past week, whether at home or in the home of a friend or relative or somewhere else. So a third of the population is explicitly saying they're watching satellite, probably higher than that if one actually had the reality as well. So some pretty striking findings there. So that's what I wanted to leave with you today. Let me just draw a couple conclusions from this data and the data that Rajesh presented earlier. I don't think there's any question that state media will continue to play a critical role in Iran. A very big audience, as we've seen, for media coming from outside of the country, and that's likely to remain the case absent any significant reforms in the domestic media environment. We've seen there's a lot of ambiguity in Iranians' attitudes towards specific media outlets, and relatively few of them enjoy unqualified trust. Satellite TV is the medium of choice in terms of its reach, the number of people you can reach on that medium, as opposed to other means of getting through to the Iranian population. There's a growing audience for the digital platforms, but what happens in Iran, particularly with respect to their success in walling off the country from the rest of the world on the web, is going to have a significant impact on the growth of digital media in the future here. So all these things taken together, there's no doubt that there continues to be a very important role for international broadcasters of the BBG, VOA Radio Farda, our friends at the BBC, and other sources. Thank you, and I think there's time for questions.
Let's give a nice round of applause to our presenters. If our presenters would join us up here at the table. We've got some time for some questions this morning, and we've got a couple of my colleagues walking around with microphones. So, if you'd wait till they bring you the microphone and then state your name and your organization, that'd be greatly appreciated. Right here.
Thank you for an excellent presentation. My name is Rasul Nafisi. I am regular contributor to Voice of America, PNN. Question about the percentage of popularity or trustworthiness of IRIB. Last visit I had to Iran was 2006. I'm a sociologist by training. I just, to any house I went, I checked what they were watching, and not a single house was watching the local TV. Although I have to say that, of course, I come from the middle-class Iranian. And at no point of Iran history of media, people trusted the local media that much, meaning 46%. I find it very hard to believe that such a number of people trusted the local TV. And I wonder if the fear factor played a role, meaning because people were interviewed over the phone, knowing that they were watched over by Big Brother, so they censored themselves and said something positive about the Iran media. Secondly, I look at the sample, 2000. Sample is pretty low for a country of 74 million people. Thirdly, methodology of research based entirely on telephone calls, considering that a lot of Iranian youth using the internet. I was wondering if the internet could be used as well in interviewing people and getting more information from them. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bill, do you want to take that?
Sure, and I'd invite my colleague Rajesh. I'm on, I guess I'm mic'd here, okay. Your first point, you're a sociologist, so you obviously understand many of the issues involved in doing research, and particularly in doing research in closed societies, and the points you've taken are certainly valid ones. One can't discount the fact that we are dealing with a sensitive topic in a closed society, and there may well be social desirability effects involved in the responses. You mentioned your own experience in going to people's households. Again, as a sociologist, you'll appreciate that a national survey involving all sectors of the population may yield different results from what any of us would experience in our personal acquaintances or our circles. So we do have in this data a very strong representative sample of the national population, and we think it gives a relatively realistic picture of what's going on in those places. I raised the point about trust. I included that slide less to show how many people expressed trust in IRB than how many people didn't express trust, even if they said they were watching the station. And as I pointed out, only half of the people said the station is very trustworthy. And so one can turn the picture around and say, well, if these people were fearful of talking to an interviewer about state radio or state television, it's striking that half of them would not say it's very trustworthy. One might hypothesize that everybody would be inclined to say that this is a trustworthy station. So there are lots of ways of interpreting this data. As far as the sample size goes, 2,000 is a very healthy sample. As you know, most opinion polling in this country, and our colleagues from Gallup know this very well, is based on samples of 1,000 or less, typically 1,500. So it's quite an adequate sample size to get a good picture nationally of the population. I think you had one other point that I may have missed.
Telephone versus face-to-face.
Telephone. Well, yeah, we would love to be able to go into Iran and do face-to-face surveys. That's not possible for both legal and political reasons. And of course, there would be other issues as well with respect to the safety of interviews and so on. So telephone surveying is the only way to go. There are certain technical aspects of telephone work that actually make it superior to face-to-face work. And we can get into those if you want separately. But we've been doing this for a number of years in Iran, getting very consistent kinds of findings, and are pretty confident with the representativeness of the work. There's no reason to believe that responses to a phone survey would be less affected by political or social factors than would be the case in face-to-face in this environment. Rajesh, you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think the only thing I would add to that is, Gallup itself has been conducting polls in Iran for the last 3-4 years. Again, we've been doing it over telephone for practical reasons. And yes, we do find some bias when you're asking questions about the regime, about the government, about political situations. But when it comes to personal behavior, we seem to find a very consistent trend where people are fairly honest and open about saying what exactly they're doing. So to the extent that many of these things we are capturing here is about access, usage, and so forth, we're very confident that the way we are gathering this information is telling us very close to the truth. I mean, there is always the question of social desirability, and as Bill pointed out, certain elements of these questions could, especially when you're talking about trustworthiness and so forth, there may be some predisposition to skewing a little more positive. But the beauty of this is actually the tracking data, if there is a change in the data, should yield us at least the momentum, which way it's going. And that's where I think there's tremendous value in gathering the data the way we are currently doing it.
What are a couple of questions you wouldn't trust?
Well, certainly anything relating to the leadership.
That question was, what are some of the question items you wouldn't trust?
Anything relating to how the economy is doing, because it sort of reflects on the political leadership, how well they're handling the situation. I would be very suspicious of some of the data.
Bruce, any comments? Okay. Next question. Right here.
Hi. Just quickly, I'm Erin Cox representing IFAS. Quickly on their willingness to participate in the survey. One, how did you have the Turkey-based firm present themselves on the phone? How did they introduce themselves? And second, do you have statistics on the number of people who refused to answer any of the questions or all of the questions? Thank you.
Yep, absolutely. These are all native Persian-speaking interviewers. So calling in, from outside the country, obviously. So anybody who's picking up the phone would automatically know the number is coming from somewhere else. So they have to introduce themselves as saying, we are calling from, wherever this place is, and we are conducting a media study, and we would like your opinions on, how you consume media, how you use media, and what your attitudes and opinions are about broadcasters in general. So at that point, there is an opportunity for either the person who's picking up the phone or the selected respondent to actually refuse. And yes, indeed, we do have refusals. We have about 35% of the people refusing to participate, either at the upfront, at the household level, or at the individual level. So combined, it's about 35%.
Right here.
Ahmad Jan Ali with the House Committee on Foreign Affairs here. My question has two parts. First, I was wondering if you could elaborate on, you talked about the use of external media, but if you could elaborate a little bit on the contents of the external media. As people try to use the media on the internet, are they, using music, foreign music, news, or foreign movies? What are the contents of that? And the second part of my question was the representativeness of the data, because I can imagine that in a survey like this, it would be attempting for the younger generation to step in and make phone calls. So how representative this data really is in terms of, if we break it down with the age group. Thank you very much.
You can take the external media.
Sure. Am I on? With respect to content, you're raising a very good question, and it's one that I think we probably need to do some more research on. I'm tempted to say all of the above in response to your question in terms of what people are using external media for. Rajesh presented some of the data about internet, and you could see that on an average day, 20% of Iranians use internet, 13% say they use internet for news. That suggests a significant portion of internet users are doing other things, as one would expect. There are various forms of entertainment. It may be game playing. It may be all kinds of things, downloading movies, although that's probably not easy in the present environment in Iran. So probably the same variety of activities that you would see in a less closed society are happening. And I mentioned earlier as well, the reliance on external media for entertainment as well as information. It's worthy of note that one of the strongest performing satellite TV stations today in Iran is Monoto TV out of London, which is an entertainment-focused station. Farsi One does pretty well as well. So again, highlighting the fact that people are using these satellite dishes not just as news sources, but as entertainment sources in addition. With respect to the representativeness of the sample, we have data we can share with you. It's not in the presentation today on the demographic breakdown, and it reflects almost perfectly the demographic composition of the Iranian population. The respondents were randomly selected in the household, so there was no bias with respect to age or other factors.
Right over here.
Hi, I'm Woody Demitz. I'm a retiree from BBG from many years back. I had a question about the availability and use of satellite dishes. And you've said that in 2000 or since 2008, the ownership or access to satellite dishes has gone up from 16% to 26%. But how does this square with what we see in the news about periodic crackdowns on ownership of sat dishes? And is this a regional phenomenon, i.e., more in Tehran or elsewhere?
Well, I'd invite my friends and colleagues who know more about what's happening on the ground in Iran to join in on this discussion. What we've heard in talking with our colleagues in the service and so on is that attitudes towards satellite dishes fluctuate over time, and that while they are officially not allowed, and we know there are crackdowns and confiscations and so on, that at the same time there's a lot of turning a blind eye on the part of the authorities to dishes, and this varies. And it may well be as well that the reason the numbers have gone up is possible, and this is pure hypothesis, is less an increase in the number of dishes than an increased willingness to report owning a dish, because they become so ubiquitous that people feel more comfortable saying, I have a dish. I don't know that that's in fact the case, but I've heard that theory expressed as well. So there's a lot of variation, and I suspect geographic as well as over time in the authorities' attitudes towards dishes. That's maybe not a satisfactory answer, but if others know the scene better and want to jump in, I'd invite that.
Bruce, any comments? Okay. There.
Dr. Srinivasan, you mentioned the respondent trepidation about providing too much sentiment regarding sensitive issues. Did you ask about use of circumvention tools for accessing the internet? Did you ask about accessing or finding blocked websites, how frequently that occurred? And do you feel that there's a general trepidation among users to provide any information about censorship tools in Iran?
First of all, I mean, we were limited in terms of the length of how many questions we can ask. I mean, this is, after all, a telephone survey, and we were already averaging about 28 minutes on the phone. So certainly, you know, we didn't go into many of those areas that you're talking about. And even if we did, I can only hypothesize that not sure how honest people would have been in answering some of these questions, especially, you know, accessing blocked websites and stuff. So,
Bruce or Bill, do you have any other thoughts on maybe internet usage and some of your statistics and what you might have seen?
Not with respect to that question. It is an issue that we'll be looking at in some qualitative research this year, so hopefully we'll have some more to pass on that respect.
Okay, right here.
Anthony Vance from the Baha'is of the United States. I wanted to follow up on the trustworthiness on of the news. In order to kind of get a feel for what those percentages mean, in other words, let's say for the IRIB, 49% very trustworthy and 40% somewhat trustworthy, what would numbers look like surveying an American audience about, you know, CBS, ABC, NBC, Fox, you know, the different major news channels here? You may not have that off the top of your head, but I'm just trying to get a sense as to, because I also, similar to the comments from one of the gentlemen earlier, I thought these numbers were extraordinarily high on the basis of things that I've heard about the credibility of state news sources. And maybe they're not for certain purposes, as one of you outlined, but maybe, you know, maybe there are comparable numbers or much higher numbers for U.S. media.
We don't necessarily have specific numbers on individual broadcasters here in the U.S. Obviously, with the proliferation of the number of media outlets, it's difficult to track today. But we do an annual study on confidence in institutions. We also do a worldwide study on media confidence. And if you go to Gallup.com, you'll be able to, I don't have the data off the top of my head, but you'll be able to find those figures with respect to Gallup.com. Okay, next question. Right here.
Rosalie O'Connell, I'm also from the BBG. My question is about the sample. It's from all provinces, but how weighted is it to cities as opposed to the towns and villages, et cetera, across the country? Because I'm struck with the fact that there are more computers listed as have people having access than to radio, with only 50% having access to radio. So what about the sample? Is it weighted towards cities?
The sample is actually drawn randomly, so it's actually across all provinces. And we ensure that in terms of representation of urban, rural, we make sure that it is reflective of what the population numbers look like. So there is no preponderance of it being around key urban areas. if that's what you're suggesting. No, we've taken care of that in terms of adjusting the data to make sure it reflects the population of urban rural.
Okay, any other questions? In the back.
I'm Chad Radishek with Strategic Social. I was really curious about the apparently large gender gap in media usage, and I wonder if that's an education thing or some other reason.
Which aspects of media usage were you referring to?
In the specific demographic breakdown based on the education and the age and so forth, it seemed like female usage was lower in all of the categories.
We'd want to really look at that slide by slide with respect to specific media. It was certainly true in the case of internet, for example, less so in the case of satellite TV. We found almost universally in doing research around the world that especially when one looks at news-oriented media outlets, that the audience among men is higher than among women. So, that may be part of what you're referring to here. With respect to internet, again, it's pretty universally the case, at least in the countries that BBG surveys, that use among men is higher than among women. And there are probably a lot of factors that go into that I won't speculate on here, but it's not at all uncommon, and often the gap is quite a bit wider than what we see in this data.
Right here.
I'm Joanna Levison with Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. I just wondered if you could expand on your conclusion, the fourth one, that satellite TV remains the medium of choice for reaching Iranians from outside the country. Your figures show a greater jump, I think, between 2010 and 2012 in internet use over satellite use. And so I'm intrigued. And does this represent consumer preferences among Iranians, or is it an access issue? If you could just unpack that a little bit, please.
Right. Well, if you go back in the presentation, I think it's one of the earlier slides in here, and look at the usage of specific websites, you can see that no website has a very large share of the entire universe of internet users. Whereas in the satellite TV universe, there are many stations which do occupy a large share of that universe. So even though the number of internet users is greater than the number of satellite users, at least in this data, the share of the audience on the part of any single outlet is much lower in the internet sphere. And this suggests to us that being on satellite TV is a more efficient way of reaching large numbers of people than being distributing via the web. Not that web distribution is something we shouldn't be doing. We should. And it potentially has a very powerful impact and resonance in the society. But in terms of the sheer numbers of population that can be reached, it's our view that it won't be in the foreseeable future as effective as satellite TV distribution.
We've got time for one last question. Over here on the...
Hi, Kiev. Just a quick question about, I hate to bring it back to this IRIB discussion, but when the question was posed to how was IRIB introduced? Because I know there are 5 different channels in Iran under the banner of IRIB. And there's IRIB 1, 2, 3, 4, and then IRIB 3 focusing mostly on sports. So I guess the question is, how was IRIB bundled into one?
The question simply referred to IRIB, and your point is well taken. There are many factors that could have influenced people's answer to that question, including the different channels under that banner. But in the confines of a short telephone survey that covered a lot of topics, one can't get into the details of the individual stations.
Okay.
Chris, if I could just add, and just by way of sort of closing, because I know we're out of time, thank everybody again for coming to this. One of the things we intend through the series is to try to educate those who are very interested in the work of international broadcasting about the environments, again, that we're operating in. It is often the case, even for us, that sometimes the findings are counterintuitive. So that you see in the situation of Iran, a heavy use of domestic media outlets and a degree of trustworthiness expressed in those outlets. We take a look at that information, of course, and we put it in the context of how we fashion our strategies for reaching these various markets. We, of course, look at a wide range of factors. We know that there is no press freedom in Iran. One of the drivers of what we do is to try to provide, obviously, a free flow of objective and accurate news and information to the people of Iran in the absence of a free press environment in the country. As we stated, and I made this point at the top, these research briefings are about these broad media environments, not to go into great depth on our individual performance data. But some of you may have come today wondering, in fact, about the performance of the Voice of America's Persian service and Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's Persian service. They do quite well in Iran. And in fact, we're seeing very strong performance for those. And we're very proud of the work that they do. The director of the Voice of America, David Ensor, is here with us today. If any of you afterwards would have a question for David. But again, our point here is to try, as we go forward in the series, Tibet, as Chris has already announced, we'll be addressing next month, and then Nigeria and Burma. All of these are difficult media environments. And they're very difficult environments to understand well because there is a lack of commercially available research, by and large, in these countries. And so the research that we're doing in our partnership with Gallup stands as among the very few ways that we know of to get access to what's happening in these countries with respect to media use. So as you take a look at this series, we encourage you to come back and sit with us as we go through these other very important places, again, Tibet coming up and Nigeria and Burma. And we'll endeavor on those occasions as well to try to understand how people are using media in these places. And we'll present the data to you as we see it from the research, even when it is, in fact, in some instances, a bit counterintuitive as we might perceive these societies from the United States.
Thank you, Bruce. Let's give one last round of applause to our panelists this morning. I'd like to thank you for joining us. Hopefully we will see you back here on July 26th for Tibet. I know our speakers will be here for a few minutes if you have any additional questions. Thank you.